Hi everyone, so this is the first part in our series about determinism for the WJEC A-Level RS spec. So in this video we're going to be looking at the Doctrine of Original Sin by St. Augustine. This is fairly easy to wrap your head around as long as you learn it under the sort of key headings. So firstly, just a bit of context on what sort of hard determinism, theological determinism actually is. So, in opposition to the traditional Judeo-Christian view that humans are free and responsible for their own actions, there is an alternative view held by some that God has decided who has been saved and who will not be. So this is rooted, like the ideas of theological determinism are kind of rooted in St. Paul's pastoral epistle to the Romans, and there's this phrase here, set apart for the gospel of God. For those he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. So there's this idea now, floating around in certain people's minds, that God knows from the beginning of time who is going to be saved and who is unfortunately not going to be saved. All events are the will of God, and thus he has already decided who will receive salvation. So there are three main proponents of this: the idea of the future being predestined by God, God's omnipotence and God's omniscience, and God's sort of foreknowledge of the future. This obviously has severe implications for the whole of society, not just theology. No free will for ethical choices, no salvation dependent on an individual's qualities, no sola fide, no sort of like salvation through works, nothing. Purely based on God's omnipotent will. However, no freedom, no responsibility, perhaps. We're going to look at that in a lot more detail in section 2. So who is St. Augustine? He was the Bishop of Hippo, and he wrote this little document called the Doctrine of Original Sin. So there was also already a lot of ideas in the Catholic Church floating around about the ideas of original sin. St. Augustine didn't necessarily create these ideas, he just formalised them into the Catholic Church at the time's official doctrine. And he did this because there was one guy called Pelagius, who we're going to be looking at in another video for the free will theme, was talking about how we have free will. And Augustine reacted really angrily to this, saying it diminished God's omnipotence. He called Pelagius a heresiarch, which is somebody who originates heretical doctrine. And the Doctrine of Original Sin was approved at the Council of Carthage, and Pelagius was denounced. So, what is the purpose of Augustine's Doctrine of Original Sin? So it is to explain the irresistible pressure to act badly, to justify infant baptism, which is something Pelagius and his followers were against, to demonstrate humans' reliance on God's grace and goodness, and obviously to defeat Pelagius. So Augustine's ideas are broken down into 5 parts for the specification. It is a lot easier if you can sort of learn, 6 parts, sorry, if you can learn these sort of under the headings. It just makes a lot more sense. I think you could possibly be asked a question alone on original sin, concupiscence, massa peccati. I think liberium arbitrium would be a bit harsh, but they probably could ask you individually on these, so you do need to know them in quite some detail. So we're going to start with concupiscence. Now, since the fall, sin is a radical defect in all human characters. We are literally born in sin. What concupiscence actually means is a longing in a sensual way, but Augustine kind of expanded the definition to really just account for all earthly desires. Money, food, sex, all of that stuff, instead of wanting God. So you've got to remember that concupiscence itself isn't actually a sin, but it's just a deficiency in the moral agent's ability to choose God. And it's a deficiency in all moral agents' characters because of Adam and Eve. So Augustine believes that physically, literally sin is, and this concupiscence is actually physically passed on through all generations, because all of humanity is related to Adam and Eve. They were all similarly present in the loins of Adam. That is a direct quote. And all humans are also born of sexual intercourse, which is itself a result of concupiscence, with the exception, of course, of Jesus. And in Catholicism, they believe that Mary is the Immaculate Conception and that she was possibly born without original sin as well. but that's a story for another time. So because of this, all humans are inherently damned, even if they don't commit any extra sin of their own. And this just shows why it's really important to baptise children ASAP. You've got to wash away that original sin in case they die in infancy. So what does masapakati mean? It literally means a lump of sin. And that is what we all are, according to St. Augustine. So in the Epistle to the Romans, Paul describes God as a potter, and we are just some lump of clay. So we are this lump of clay, a lump of sinful clay, and we have no worth independent of the potter's hand. God has to shape us because we are so hopelessly corrupted, we can merely do evil and desire evil. And thus humanity's ability to choose freely, which Augustine says that we should have, is thus infected and corrupted by sin. And this is what we're talking about here when we're talking about our choice, our ability to choose freely. This is known as liberum arbitrium. This is our inherently, essentially free nature. It refers to our innate freedom, and it sort of talks about the idea that before the fall, Adam could have abstained from sin. However, we lose our liberty to our sinful nature. So, according to this doctrine, we kind of have almost two innate natures. One is a freedom given to us by God, and the second is this overriding concupiscence that acts as a secondary human nature to override our innate freedom. Free will has been utterly wasted by sin, with us unable to make moral choices, as our dominant concupiscence predetermines all moral agents to sin. We can't control our desires, and for some reason Augustine illustrated this with the idea of unwanted erections. So, take that how you will. Because we have lost our liberty, our God-given liberty from God due to our concupiscence, every moral agent is thus predestined to be a sinner prenatally before they're born, and is thus technically damned to hell as a sinner. God responds to this. God's grace, God's loving kindness, some will receive salvation. But this choice is not based on an individual, it's not based on their faith, it's not based on their actions, it's not based on anything. It's just randomly given to a small fixed number who can't ask for or deserve it. And thus, humanity is broken down into two groups. There's a sort of dichotomy of humanity here. You have the elect and you have the reprobates. The elect are the saints. It always reminds me of that song, when the saints go marching in or something like that. They can't resist marching in. They can't resist this calling of grace. They are predestined to salvation before they're born, and Jesus only died for the elect. The reprobates, however, which is like most of us, are passed over by God. Now, this is super important. Don't make this mistake. God does not actively choose the reprobates. That would be against his omnibenevolent nature. He just passes over these, and this is known as single predestination. We're going to be looking at double predestination in another video. But God just passes over these people. And this is not unjust, according to St. Augustine. This is humanity's natural state. It's not unjust, because this is what should happen to all of us. It's only through God's loving kindness, through his omnibenevolence, that he saves any of us. He doesn't have to do it. There are, of course, many criticisms of the doctrine of original sin. So, this was a pre-scientific era. It's the 4th century. We're literally talking about the 4th century. They knew absolutely nothing of genetic coding. They knew nothing of the Bible's socio-historical context. They also assumed that literalist position that Adam and Eve were real people. This whole theory falls down without that tableau of Adam and Eve literally in the garden eating an apple. The idea also of moral depravity being transmitted biologically is completely unscientific. We looked at Lamarckianism in, I think it was Freud. Yeah, it was Freud. And this almost sounds like Lamarckian, I'm not sure, biology. And that is the idea that organisms can pass on characteristics developed in a parent's lifetime, not just genetic characteristics, but so like scars, tattoos, stuff like that, or perhaps original sin. Or if we're talking about Freud, primal guilt. But we're not talking about Freud here, we're talking about Augustine. But this idea is completely disproven. Modern genetics have said that you can only pass on genetic characteristics. If you dye your hair ginger, your kid is not going to be ginger. You can also just interpret the Bible differently, and that's all exegesis means. There is loads of assumption in both the Old and New Testaments of free moral choice, and you can learn all these quotes for the free will section, so it's like super easy. These two themes are really interchangeable. A blessing if you obey, a curse if you disobey. So you have free will to either obey or disobey, surely. This one in Galatians, you know, you were called to be free. There is neither male nor female in Christ Jesus, like neither Jew nor Gentile. So you're not sort of determined by your sex, by your sort of ethnic status. You're free. You are free. And this is a really good one. Jesus, when he was healing a blind man in John, literally says to the blind man that your blindness had nothing to do with his sin or the sin of his parents. Obviously, there was like an idea floating about that if you were disabled, that would possibly come as a divine punishment, maybe. But Jesus was like, absolutely not, absolutely not. The easiest one about God wanting all people to be saved is who desires all men to be saved. Learn the one from Timothy. That's the easiest in that yellow box. There is also the idea that Augustine developed his sin doctrine on a mistranslation. So the passage that we talked about in the pastoral epistle to the Romans says, death passed upon all men in whom all sinned. And Augustine saw this and thought, okay, well, so Adam passed on moral defects. But this was a Latin translation from an earlier Greek text, which said, death passed to all, comma, in all that sinned, which seems to imply that death comes from our own original sins. So what Augustine saw this as may not actually reflect the original intentions of the writer. That was a bit hard to get your head around, to be honest. I would probably go for the different exegesis or the pre-scientific era one if I were you. Different views of authorities. Again, we've got like other really important people saying exactly the opposite. And this one's quite interesting as well. Political motives at the time. It leaves people seeing themselves as unable to self-govern. So is this maybe a little bit of a win-win for St. Augustine? He can get really famous with a doctrine, and he can also legitimize possibly repressive ethics of the church. He can legitimize the church having to guide morality, and it almost infantilizes the whole of the human race. So that is it for Augustine. We're looking now at Calvin's doctrine of election, which is a little bit more complicated. So I'll see you in the next.